Good evening. Here it is Wednesday. We're back again for midweek Bible study. So glad you're here. Hope you had a good week. Sure can't complain about the weather. The weather's been beautiful and good to have it. Let's give the prayer tonight. And Greg Barton, would you lead some prayer, please? We're going to look at a Bible character tonight in the Scriptures, and beforehand, ask a few little questions here. Matthew wrote the book of Matthew. Matthew was one that took Jesus' place, became an apostle. Luke, we know, being a physician, he wrote the book of Luke. John, being an apostle, wrote the book of John. Who wrote the book of Mark? You can't say just Mark. Who wrote the book of Mark? The second gospel. Mark. Well, the answer is on the screen. John Mark is the one that wrote the book. The one that most remember him by is going on the first missionary journey, and for whatever reason it would be, he quit, went back home. But he is the one that's been given credit for writing the book of Mark. John is his Hebrew name, and Mark is his Roman name, John Mark. The Bible mentions him at times as John, and the Bible says sometimes Mark or Marcus, and then sometimes it will call him John Mark. So he is a man that turned his back, stopped, but then again he turned it around later and got back on the missionary trail. So that's what we're going to look at tonight, him and a couple others in the Bible. Sometimes they're names that we read and we don't really give a lot of thought about them, but God put them there for a reason. But the first time we hear about John Mark is in Acts 12 and verse 12 at his house. And this is when Peter, he's in prison. James, the apostle, has been martyred by Herod. And Herod has intention on killing Peter too. But by miraculous means, Peter is released by an angel. And he goes to the house of Mary. And Mary's son is John Mark. So when he had considered this, he came to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose surname was Mark, where many were gathered together praying. So Peter goes to the house of Mary. There's John Mark. He's there as well. Many believe that Mary is a widow. She's not mentioned. He's not mentioned. A husband is not mentioned. Very possible that if whoever he was, that he may have been a Roman because of the word Mark. That's a Roman name. That's a possibility, but we don't know that exactly. So John Mark here is surrounded by a lot of godly people. The church here probably is meeting in the house of Mary. And that's why when they came together to pray for Peter's release, they go to her house because they probably were already accustomed to going to her house. And there they are praying. And, of course, Peter shows up at the front door knocking, and he's there to tell his story. And, of course, John Mark is there, and he hears all this. He hears about this miraculous release and firsthand. And probably, who knows, all the other things he's going to hear as we'll get into it. But he is there, and we find him at his home and his mother, their name of Mary. John Mark had a very popular uncle. Who was he in the Bible? the name is Barnabas. Barnabas was his mother's brother. Now we got two verses here, both the same verse. One's the New King James, one's the King James. And some may think, well, we got a contradiction, but it's not a contradiction. It says there in the New King James, Archus, my fellow prisoner, greets you with Mark, the cousin of Barnabas. And then the King James says, Archus, my fellow prisoner, salute you, and Marcus, sister's son to Barnabas. We can't be a cousin if he's going to be Barnabas's. If Barnabas is Mary's brother, then he's going to be a nephew. What you got to understand, the word cousin there in the Greek simply means kinfolk, kinsman. So it doesn't necessarily mean that he was the cousin. It's meaning here he was kin to Barnabas in that way, because his mother and Barnabas were brothers, sisters. So if John Mark didn't have a father, at least none's mentioned. If he didn't have a father, then Barnabas may very well have taken his place to some degree. He would have been the father figure to John Mark. And what a better one to have, because we know what Barnabas means. He was a son of encouragement. He was an encourager, and so therefore Barnabas may have taken on that role to some degree to bring about the maturity of John Mark. Now we go to Acts 15 and verse 36. This is where the first missionary journey pretty much ended, and the second one is about to begin. And Paul is choosing someone to go with him. It says there, and then after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, let us now go back and visit our brethren in every city where we have preached the word of the Lord, and see how they are doing. Now Barnabas was determined to take with them John, called Mark. But Paul insisted that they should not take with them the one who had departed from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. The contention became so sharp that they parted from one another, and so Barnabas took Mark and sailed to Cyprus. So Paul doesn't want to take him. He quit the first time. I can't trust him. What's to say he won't do it a second time? But Barnabas was determined. This is my nephew. I'm going to make sure that he's not discouraged. And if he doesn't want to go with Paul, me and Mark, Barnabas says, we'll go our separate ways, and that's what they did. And of course, they covered twice as much ground. And a contention came about, pretty sharp. Probably words were said. So Barnabas goes with Mark, and Paul goes with Silas, and they go their way. So Barnabas was right in doing this, right in taking a stand with John Mark. But as we know, and it's in Acts 13 and verse 13, is where John Mark, for whatever the reason was, he quit. And when Paul and his party set sail to Paphos, there came to Perga in Pamphylia, and John departed from them, returning to Jerusalem. No reason is given. I don't think it was because John Mark got sick. That would be no reason for Paul to say, I don't trust him anymore. People get sick. You can get sick. It wasn't sickness, or Paul wouldn't have made the stand the way he did, not taking him. Could have been that John Mark got away and got to thinking about, there's Mom. She's a widow. She's by herself. She's going to need some help. Don't know. But it could have been. He said, well, I got to go back and help her. So maybe he did. Maybe he just got homesick. Maybe the persecution that Paul was having, he had second thoughts about it. What was taking place We don't know why he quit. But he realized his error, and I'm sure Barnabas was there to encourage him to get back in doing what was right. And in 2 Timothy 4:11, we read this of Paul. He says, "Only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me for ministry." And then there in Philemon 1:23 and 24, there Mark is called my fellow laborer. So Paul has put it all behind him. He realizes through Barnabas that John Mark is capable of doing this job, a fellow laborer. He's useful. He calls for him for help. So everything's good. Everything's good. So Paul made a mistake here. Barnabas was an encourager, and he made sure that John Mark was held in a good way of learning. It is also believed, Demas did, forsook him. I don't know if Demas did after this, the writing. Is this the same Demas? We know what Demas did. If it's the same one, then he forsook him. Sure did. And Paul would have taken him back, I'm sure, if Demas had repented and come back. It's also believed that Peter was the one that converted John Mark. In 1 Peter 5:13, he says, "She who is in Babylon, elect together with you, greets you, and so does Mark, my son." Not his son biologically, but his son spiritually. So very well could be that Peter converted him. Don't know that, but it could be for him to use that kind of language. Mark, my son. When did it happen? Was it before Peter's imprisonment? Was it after Peter's imprisonment when he went home to Mary's house and John Mark hears all the story and sees all this? We don't know when it happened, but that's a good possibility that that's what happened. It is also believed that much of the material that you find in the book of Mark, the gospel, came directly from Peter. It is believed that Mark is the first gospel that was written, and very well that Peter could have instructed him and told him about everything that was taking place, and therefore he wrote it down. And that's what some of the early church fathers wrote in their writings, not inspired, but here's what they wrote. One by the name of Papias, who lived between 60 A.D. and 130 A.D., he called Mark Peter's interpreter. And that word meaning he wrote down what Peter said. He was taking notes what Peter came about. So it's very possible that where he got his material to write was from Peter or some of the other apostles. But being Mark's my son and being close as he was, very well that could have happened. So a lot of people was associated with Mark, godly people. He had a godly mother. He had Barnabas. He had Peter. He had Paul. Mark couldn't go wrong. And what we see here, it makes a difference who we associate with. If we associate with godly people, we will be godly. If we associate with the ungodly, then we're going to be ungodly as well. When I mean associate, I mean, hey, we're right there side by side all the way with them. Not just a everyday contact with somebody or speaking to somebody, but if the ungodly is our best friend, they might want to be careful about that. And Mark writes something that no other writer in the gospel writes about. On the night when Christ was arrested, whenever the apostles fled, and some wonder who this is. Mark 14, verse 51. Now a certain young man followed him, having a linen cloth thrown around his naked body. And the young men laid hold of him, and he left the linen cloth and fled from them naked. Some believe that this is John Mark. Don't know. He doesn't call him. It's not just a young man. It's not just a young man. It is a certain young man. Certain meaning people knew him. People knew him. So it's possible here, many think that John Mark just didn't mention himself as being the one that fled and got stripped of the robe there and ran away naked. Might be a little embarrassing to write that about yourself. I don't know, but anyway, only Mark talks about it, gives us that insight there, and some think that that was him. So there's a few details about John Mark. Every time he's mentioned in the Scriptures and what kind of young man he was and what he wrote. Now you know who wrote the book of Mark. John Mark is the writer of the book of Mark. The next one we're going to look at is Epaphras. Maybe he's one that we read of his name, but we sort of skip over it. But Philemon chapter 1, 23 and 24 talks about Epaphras. Paul says, my fellow prisoner in Christ Jesus greets you. As Paul is writing this letter to Philemon, they're in prison. There's another in prison with him, Epaphras. Now, verse 24, there's Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, Luke, my fellow laborers. These other three, they're not in prison, but they're there in a sense with him, maybe visiting with him, but they're not in the cell as Epaphras is. Why do we need that name? Why Epaphras? God put it there for a reason. He didn't put it there just to fill a page. He put it there for a reason. Maybe he's in prison because he got in trouble for teaching truth as Paul did. Maybe that's why he's there. But he was there with Paul, and Philemon may have known him. The way Paul writes, Epaphras, my fellow prisoner, greets you. Hello. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But Paul fills that in when he's speaking or writing to Philemon. Other good things are said about Epaphras. In Colossians 1 and verse 7, as you also learn from Epaphras, our dear fellow servant, who is a faithful minister of Christ on your behalf. Paul says he's a fellow servant. He's dear to Paul. And he's a faithful minister. And that's a lot of good words to be said about him. And many think that Epaphras was the one that maybe got this church started in Colossae. Maybe he was the one that got it organized and started, was their minister at one time. You go to chapter 4, verse 12, there are Colossians. Epaphras, who is one of you, a bondservant of Christ, greets you, always laboring fervently for you in prayers, that you may stand perfect and complete in all the will of God. For I bear him witness that he has a great zeal for you, as those who are in Laodicea and those in Hierapolis. So some think maybe he had a possibility of starting the church at Laodicea or Hierapolis as well. Maybe he knew that there. But the church knew about him. The church loved him. He had a great zeal. He prayed for the church. He prayed that the church would stand perfect and complete, as we see there in the will of God. Teach it all. Don't hold any of it back. A great zeal. So he was praying for the brethren, for them, those particular congregations. And we should be praying for our brethren as well. We should be praying for the church universal. And we need to be praying for this congregation. Other congregations that we know, we have connections with, sure pray for them. Pray for this congregation. Maybe every time, not every time you pray, but at least, some. Be thinking about the work here and where we want to be and what we can do. So Epaphras is one that was mentioned. A lot of good words. 3 times he's mentioned there in the Scriptures. And faithful minister. Faithful he was to Paul. Our last one is Trophimus. Acts 20 verse 4. And so Peter of Berea accompanied him to Asia. Aristarchus, Secundus of Thessalonians, Gaius of Derbe, and Timothy, and Titius, and Trophimus of Asia. Prior to this, if you read prior to this in 19, Paul sent these men ahead of him. People were after Paul, and they were trying to kill him. And he was going to go a different way. So he sends these 6 individuals on ahead of him to Troas, and they're there for 3 months before Paul gets there. They're worshiping with the congregation. And in Acts 20 verse 7, a verse that we should know well, when they gathered the first day of the week, take the Lord's Supper. Guess who was there? Trophimus was there. And he was there taking the Lord's Supper. He was there to hear Paul preach to midnight. He was there when Eutychus fell out of the window and Paul brought him back to life. Trophimus saw all of this. And it had to have an effect on him. To hear Paul, to see all this that was happening, to be worshiping with the brethren and traveling with Paul. Again, Trophimus had to be a man that had to learn much. Then in Acts 21 in verse 29, Paul gets in somewhat trouble here. Not that he's done anything wrong, but he gets accused of doing wrong. These men who were with him, they go with Paul to Jerusalem. And there's some Jews there that were spreading the rumor that Paul was saying to the Jews, you need to forget about Moses. There's nothing to him. You need to forget about the law of God, the 10 Commandments, and all the other laws. There's nothing to it. Now, Paul certainly was teaching we don't follow that anymore, but he wasn't saying you get rid of it. You don't need it. He wasn't saying that at all. Sometimes in the church, people will, when talking about the church, they will say, y'all don't believe in the Old Testament, do you? That's what sometimes we get accused of. Y'all don't believe in the Old Testament. That's what they're saying to Paul. You don't believe in the Old Testament anymore. Well, we certainly do believe in the Old Testament. Every word that's written there, every word that's inspired, we just don't live under that law. And that's what Paul, I'm sure, was teaching here. And some of them didn't like it. So Paul goes into the temple one day. He's there. He's going to be teaching. He goes into the temple. And they accuse him of carrying Trophimus, the Ephesian, with him in the city. And they suppose that Paul had brought into the temple. Paul wouldn't do that. Trophimus was a Gentile. Gentiles were not allowed in the temple. Paul wouldn't have done that. He wouldn't just, for the sake of doing it, do it to cause a stir. You see here, they supposed. Paul never says that he did. They just suppose that he did this, just maybe trying to get the crowd stirred up. And they certainly got the crowd stirred up. And Paul had to be taken. As you read the rest of 21, he had to be taken in 22. And eventually he went before Felix and all this. He had to be put aside somewhere for his own safety, because the crowd was so mad as to what he did. So here's Trophimus, right in the middle of this controversy, a matter of life and death to Paul, maybe even to him. I figure if he did go in there as a Gentile, well, they'd probably go after him, probably kill him, skin him alive for doing that. But we'd have no evidence other than what this man said he supposed that Trophimus went in there, that Paul took him in. I didn't see him, just supposed that he did, because they were with him later other places. And then the last verse that most people remember about Trophimus, 2 Timothy 4:20. Erastus stayed in Corinth, but Trophimus I have left in Miletus sick. Poor old Trophimus. He's sick. Paul leaves him behind. He's too sick to travel, I guess. Why didn't Paul heal him? Why didn't Paul heal the man? What the problem was? He left him sick. Reason being that healing wasn't just for the sake of healing. Healing was a way of proving or showing to the listeners who didn't believe that these men who are speaking are from God. These men who are speaking to you are inspired. And if you don't believe it, look at the miraculous things they're doing. And that's why Miletus, he left him in Miletus sick, because he was already a believer. He didn't need to heal Trophimus to make him a believer. He was already a believer. And again, there's others that Paul didn't heal. He didn't heal Timothy with his stomach problems. And Paul didn't heal himself, whatever that thorn in the flesh was. So Trophimus here was a believer, certainly a believer, but he got left behind due to sickness, whatever it may be. Any thoughts on Trophimus? All right, that's the only three we're going to cover tonight. Next week we're going to look at a few more names in the Scripture. Sometimes we just sort of read and overread. We don't think a lot about it, but they have, sometimes names are just mentioned. We don't know anything about them, but they're there. It would be nice to have your name in the Bible if it's just mentioned. If your name was just written there, no details given about you. That'd be a nice thing to say. My name's in the Word of God. That'd be nice. All right, we'll take up next week with another individual in the Scriptures.